The Honourable Member for Littlebow.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to rise in the House today and speak to the Government's Bill 3 on supplementary supply. I too, with many of my colleagues, are here to say that yes, I too am disappointed that we have to vote to spend more money for the 2015-2016 fiscal year that's about to end, given that this government passed a budget less than 4 months ago. But there are some good initiatives here that require funding. Now, it should not come as a surprise to anyone here if I were to suggest that I and my colleagues don't always see eye to eye with the government here. But I think that we can both agree that there was no shortage of waste or efficiencies left behind by the previous government. That's why I find it odd that the new government somehow needs new unbudgeted spending approved. Now, just last week I stood here and was critical of Bill 2 in the interim supply. Those criticisms of unbudgeted spending are just as valid in regard to this bill as they were to that one. These are important initiatives in the supplementary supply. I have no doubt about that, but it was only a few months ago that we stood here and approved the last provincial budget. So it's not readily clear to me why these important initiatives were not designated priorities by the NDP government in that budget. So I just want to talk about seniors and infrastructure. Why are these listed in supplementary supply list only afterthoughts set to receive unbudgeted funding that was not being offset by efficiencies in other areas? For instance, there's a sudden $50 million transfer from the capital plan to seniors. Just last week, I stood here and noted that infrastructure had lapsed a massive $1 billion last year, even though there's no shortage of much needed infrastructure in Alberta. But despite that lapse, there was a request in interim supply. And suddenly, as noted here in supplementary supply, they suddenly found a $50 million efficiency in infrastructure to transfer to seniors. That one I have a little trouble with. I would hope that there's a fair explanation for that forthcoming. Perhaps it's an accounting error. Now, the more important questions are these. How many spaces for seniors will be created with this $50 million? Let's not forget that Alberta seniors built this province. The government needs to ensure it's not just throwing unbudgeted money around with no clear goals, no clear indication of how outcomes will be measured. That's important. Seems to be lacking. That said, I'll admit that I'm glad to see here in the supplementary estimates that the government is taking action to protect Albertans in High River by transferring funds already budgeted to make sure that a berm is built. But I do have to say that I'm perplexed as to why this is happening now and not several months ago. As far as the debt's concerned, again, I want to preface these next comments by saying that we recognize that there are important items in supplementary supply appropriation. But this remains unbudgeted spending. Supplementary estimates are, of course, not uncommon for any government at any level. This wouldn't be as unusual if the budget and subsequent main estimates had appeared in the spring. But that only came in November. And I would add we are discussing and voting on this in mid-March, at a time when we should be discussing an actual proposed budget. Again, I have to ask, why didn't the government just take the time and effort and finally just release a budget? Look at all the departments that had to work and how much untold work went into interim supply and supplementary supply budgets. How many untold hours were spent creating those two documents? These same departments are now converged and working on the budget for this spring that's going to be put out on April 14th. Again, I ask, why didn't the government just take the time and effort to just release a proper budget? Now, I gather from the government's responses in recent days that there is a reasonable explanation for why some of these items could not be included in the previous budget. But even the government should recognize that it's somewhat ridiculous to need both a supplementary and interim supply appropriations for only 4 short months after a proper budget was introduced in November. It's my sincere hope that in the next fiscal year that the government will do a better job of trying to get their fiscal house in order. My colleague made a good point about the difference between $1 million and $1 billion, and I had one that I remembered 30 years ago that was brought to my attention, and it always stuck with me. 1 million minutes ago, it was 2014. 1 billion minutes ago, Christ walked on the earth. The difference between 1 million and 1 billion is so staggering that it becomes hard to remember and recognize what those numbers really are. My colleagues, he also made a good point about the situation we find ourselves in with, Albertans find themselves in with their own households. They have to make difficult decisions. And their businesses, they have to make difficult decisions on those. And they're now asking, why isn't my government being more responsible with my money and my children's future? I'll just touch on jobs and labor. In fact, what's most disappointing about discussing a supply bill instead of an actual budget, is that it means it's much longer before Albertans actually know what the answers will be that they've been asking. Take jobs, for instance. This government seems to have diverted any substantial detail, any initiative that can actually help Albertans facing hardship in the economic downturn with mere quips about waiting for the budget, which comes out on April 14th. That's a whole calendar month away, Madam Speaker. For Albertans employed, that's one more month of trying to make ends meet, hoping that their savings can last at least another year, or at least that much longer. It's one more month for municipalities in my riding and ridings around this province to understand where the MSI funding is at, so they can have some rock-solid decisions made here that they can build their budgets on. They rely on that money. While I'm talking about that, I would congratulate the former government. That program, I wasn't a councillor at the time, but I became a councillor shortly after that program was brought in. I'm glad to see that this government is continuing with MSI. That is very important to those that require it in municipalities. The supplementary estimates allocate $3 million to labour. Allegedly, these are for labour market development goals, but they're not specific at all. What programs are they going to? And there's no detail. How many Albertans can expect training? No detail. What is the cost per Alberta for Albertan helped? No details there. In fact, it's not readily clear that this allocation will help Albertans based on the lack of information. Skills, training, and labour market development are important now more than ever. That's why it's important that the government speak to actual numbers, actual assessments that anything they're doing is helping. I note that my colleague from Cardston Tabor Warner asked the Minister of Labour a series of questions earlier this week inquiring about the surprising explanatory note on the labour increase. There didn't seem to be a ready answer. Specifically, the government claimed that the $3 million would be offset by a federal transfer from the Canada-Alberta Job Fund for labour market development. Well, that's an existing agreement. It's been on the books since 2014. There's no reason the government wouldn't have known about it. So really, if it's an offsetting supplementary increase, doesn't that really just mean that existing skills training transfer wasn't being used? I think that's problematic because in this economy, skills training is more important more now than ever with Albertans out of work. So, Madam Speaker, the facts of this request for $3 million tells Albertans nothing about how the money will be used to create jobs, provide skills training, or support apprentices. Alberta's unemployment rate's continuing to go up. Now it's 7.9% at the end of last month. The government's failed jobs subsidy program has already cost Albertans $178 million and created no jobs. the government has so far been shockingly vague on its further plans for supporting job creation. And you know, Bill 1 is just a shell that proposes no concrete solutions, no specific programs, and no real path to job creation. So yes, while we support labour market programming, there's some skepticism on this side of the House about what results this government is getting. The government needs to outline which programs it will direct with this funding toward and how it will be reporting on the successes of the program. That's the part that's so important, is how we report to Albertans on the success of each and every one of these programs. Success in this instance needs to be measured in jobs created, not just money spent. This doesn't mean we won't support this bill in principle, but I do hope, for the sake of unemployed Albertans, like good, hard-working people around this province, that they have some specific goals and targets that they can share with all of us. Just a comment on protecting front lines. You know, what strikes me as the most bizarre is that this government that somehow has the audacity to accuse us of wanting to cut frontline workers, as if any level of constructive criticism about their massive overspending is interpreted as being a call to cut from front lines. No. Finding efficiencies is profoundly different from cutting front lines. This accusation comes from a government that itself is cutting frontline workers. Last week, it was announced that long-term care beds in Sundre Hospital would close. My colleague at the front took exception with that, made everyone aware that that closure could result from anywhere from 18 to 36 beds, long-term beds closed. Frontline workers would be losing their jobs. Vulnerable individuals would be moving away from their community, the community that they know. This government is at least $10 billion in debt. Yes, billion with a B, the difference between an M and a B. And still requesting more unbudgeted spending, and yet they find the time to cut frontline workers. That speaks volumes about the government's ability to manage our provincial finances and set priorities. So, Madam Speaker, again, my colleagues and I recognize that there are worthwhile initiatives in the supplementary estimates, but my colleagues and I are strongly skeptical that this particular government was unable to find efficiencies in the last budget to cover the costs of these worthy initiatives. More problematic is that these important initiatives were not designated priorities by the government in their budget, which was only 4 short months ago. Albertans are already hurting in this economy. Many are struggling to make ends meet while looking for a new job. We here owe it to them to ensure that their tax dollars are spent wisely. For example, once again, I don't think anyone here is opposed to investing in labour market programming in a time like this, but in their last budget, that department committed to spending nearly $100 million in workforce strategies, and Albertans should know what they have to show for it. Unless this government is capable of answering how many jobs specifically they anticipate creating and can fully defend those programs in working to the fullness of their ability in the current situation, then all they're really doing is racking up more spending. I know some of my colleagues have already asked the same question, but you know, there hasn't been a consistent answer. So we continue to ask. Regrettably, the government's request on the supplementary estimates looking to increase labour market spending, somehow offset by a federal transfer via the Canada-Alberta Job Fund, just raises more questions than it answers. Why isn't that transfer already being used for skills funding, skills training? Are these skills training and labour market programs actually working? I think I speak not just for the constituents of Little Bow, but for many across Alberta, Madam Speaker, when I say I do hope this government has an actual answer for what they're doing here with this supply bill. Thank you, Madam Speaker.